13th of September, 1931. The Solent, that grey stretch of water between the Isle of Wight and the English mainland. 500,000 people lined the beaches and cliff tops, craning their necks toward an empty sky. They had come to witness the final of the Schneider Trophy, the most prestigious air race in the world. 3 nations were supposed to compete. Only one had shown up. The French had withdrawn weeks earlier. The Italians had been favourites, their Marchi seaplanes screaming around test courses at record speeds. But 2 of their pilots had lost their lives in training accidents, and Rome had pulled out just 7 days before the race. The course was deserted. No rivals, no contest. A single aircraft appeared over the water, silver blue, impossibly sleek, riding low on twin floats. The Supermarine S-6B carved through the September air at 340 miles per hour, banking around the triangular course with mechanical precision. At the controls sat Flight Lieutenant John Boothman of the Royal Air Force High-Speed Flight. He would complete 7 perfect laps without another aircraft in sight. On the shore, watching through the crowds, stood the man who had designed it. Reginald Mitchell was 36 years old. He had just won Britain permanent possession of one of aviation's greatest prizes. Within 6 years, he would be gone, and his next aircraft would change the course of history. Mitchell had not arrived at that shoreline through the usual channels. The men who designed aircraft for the Air Ministry tended to come from Cambridge or Imperial College, with connections in Whitehall and memberships at the right clubs. Mitchell came from a village called Butt Lane in Staffordshire, the son of a schoolteacher. His path to aviation began with steam locomotives. At 16, he started an apprenticeship at Kerr, Stewart and Company in Stoke-on-Trent, learning to shape metal in the service of railway engines. During the day, he worked in the drawing office. In the evenings, he attended night classes in mathematics, mechanics and technical drawing. It was not glamorous, but it was thorough. By the time he left, he understood how machines worked from the ground up. In 1917, at 22 years old, Mitchell took a job with a small aviation firm called Supermarine in Southampton. The company built flying boats and seaplanes, mostly for the Admiralty. 2 years later, the position of chief designer fell vacant. Supermarine gave it to Mitchell. He was 24, had no university degree, and knew almost nobody in the London aviation establishment. What he did have was an instinct for aerodynamics and an absolute refusal to accept compromise in his designs. It would prove to be enough. The Schneider Trophy had been running since 1912, the brainchild of Jacques Schneider, a French financier with a passion for aviation. Schneider had made his fortune in armaments, but a boating accident had left him partially paralysed and ended his own flying ambitions. The trophy he commissioned was a bronze sculpture of extraordinary ugliness, a winged figure kissing a wave mounted on a marble plinth. The rules were simple: seaplanes racing around a closed course over water. Fastest time wins. Any nation that won 3 consecutive races would keep the trophy permanently. The prize money was modest, around £1,000, but by the 1920s the contest had become something else entirely. It was a technological arms race conducted at 200 miles per hour. The early races had been gentlemanly affairs, with average speeds barely exceeding 45 miles per hour. The Great War changed everything. 4 years of aerial combat had produced engines of unprecedented power and pilots who understood what aircraft could really do. When the trophy races resumed in 1919, the speeds began to climb. Italy, France, the United States and Britain poured government money into ever more powerful machines. What had started as a sporting event became a matter of national prestige, a proving ground where countries demonstrated the superiority of their aviation industries. The Americans dominated the early 20s with their Curtiss biplanes, purpose-built racing machines that pushed speeds past 200 miles per hour. The Italians answered with the Macchi series, sleek monoplanes designed by Mario Castoldi. France struggled to keep pace. Britain, after some embarrassing early performances, turned to Supermarine and their young chief designer. Mitchell began designing Supermarine's Schneider entries in the mid-20s, and each iteration represented a leap forward. The S4 of 1925 was revolutionary, a monoplane with a monocoque fuselage, far cleaner than anything that had come before. It crashed during trials, but Mitchell learned from the failure. The S5 that followed was more conservative in some ways, more refined in others. It won the 1927 race at Venice, with an average speed of 281 miles per hour. The victory gave Britain its first Schneider win since 1922, and it established Mitchell as the foremost designer of high-speed aircraft in the country. For 1929, Mitchell pushed further. The S6 was a complete redesign, built around a new Rolls-Royce engine, designated simply R. This power unit was a marvel of engineering in its own right, a supercharged V12 producing 1900 horsepower, more than 3 times the output of contemporary fighter engines. The heat it generated was so intense that conventional cooling systems could not cope. Mitchell solved the problem by running coolant through the aircraft's skin, turning the wings and floats into enormous radiators. The S6 took the 1929 contest at 328 miles per hour. These were not merely racing machines. They were the fastest aircraft on Earth, quicker than any fighter in any air force. The races themselves were spectacles that drew hundreds of thousands of spectators. The aircraft would take off from the water, circle a triangular course marked by pylons, and complete 7 laps at speeds that made them difficult to follow with the naked eye. Engines screamed at full power for the entire race, often failing spectacularly. Pilots flew with their bodies pressed into their seats by the G-forces of the turns, navigating by instinct as much as sight. The margins between victory and catastrophe were measured in seconds and inches. One more victory would secure the trophy for Britain forever. Then Ramsay MacDonald's Labour government announced it would not provide funding for the 1931 race. The official explanation cited sufficient data already gathered on high-speed flight. The Treasury argued that 2 successful contests had demonstrated British capability, and further expenditure was unnecessary. The real reason was simpler. The Wall Street crash had made austerity fashionable, and air racing looked like an extravagance the nation could not afford. The public reaction was immediate and furious. The Daily Mail launched a campaign demanding government support. Letters flooded into Parliament. The Royal Aero Club, responsible for organising British participation, calculated that £100,000 would be needed to mount a credible challenge. Without government backing, there seemed no way to raise such a sum, and then, from an unexpected quarter, salvation arrived. Lady Lucy Houston was 63 years old in 1931. She had been born into poverty, worked as a chorus girl, and married 3 times, each husband wealthier than the last. Her third husband, Sir Robert Houston, had been a shipping magnate worth millions. When he passed away in 1926, she inherited his fortune and immediately set about spending it on causes that reflected her particular worldview. She was an eccentric patriot of the most theatrical variety, fiercely right-wing, viscerally opposed to socialism, and convinced that Britain was being betrayed by weak politicians. She kept a yacht named Liberty in Southampton Water, festooned with enormous banners attacking the Labour government in terms that bordered on libellous. She had funded the first flight over Mount Everest. She would later express admiration for Mussolini. In January 1931, Lady Houston wrote a personal cheque for £100,000, roughly $8.5 million in today's money. She attached a single condition, that the government commit to supporting the effort. Her letter to the Prime Minister was characteristically blunt. She accused MacDonald of being willing to let foreigners carry off the trophy through government cowardice. The cheque, she suggested, would prevent Britain from becoming a laughingstock. The government rather quickly reversed its position. Mitchell had 9 months to prepare. There was no time to design a new aircraft from scratch, so he refined the S6 into the S6B, extracting every possible improvement from the existing airframe. Rolls-Royce pushed the R engine to 2,350 horsepower, an astonishing figure that required special fuel blends to achieve. The RAF reformed its high-speed flight unit to train pilots capable of handling such machines. Everything was rushed, improvised, desperate. The French team withdrew, unable to complete their aircraft in time. The Italians had been working on the Macchi MC-72, a revolutionary design with 2 engines driving contra-rotating propellers. During trials, the engine suffered catastrophic backfiring at high speeds. 2 pilots lost their lives in separate accidents. A week before the race, Italy withdrew, leaving Britain alone on the course. The September victory, uncontested as it was, proved the design's potential. Flight Lieutenant Boothman completed 7 flawless laps, watched by crowds who had expected a duel and witnessed instead a demonstration. 2 weeks later, another S-6B set a world speed record of 407 miles per hour, a figure that would stand for years. Mitchell had built the fastest aircraft in history. The ugly bronze trophy went to the Science Museum in London, where it remains today. But a racing seaplane was not a fighter. The Air Ministry wanted combat aircraft, machines that could climb, turn and carry guns. Mitchell's first attempt to give them one would prove to be a humiliation. In 1931, while Mitchell was consumed with Schneider preparations, the Air Ministry issued Specification F730. The document outlined what Britain needed in a modern fighter, a single-seat aircraft capable of at least 250 miles per hour, armed with 4 machine guns, able to operate by day or night. The biplanes currently serving with the Royal Air Force were reaching obsolescence, and the Ministry wanted something that could meet the threats of the next decade. Every major British aircraft manufacturer was invited to submit proposals. Mitchell saw an opportunity. The same principles that made his seaplanes fast, he reasoned, could be applied to a combat aircraft. He proposed the Type 224. On paper, the logic was sound. Mitchell had spent years refining high-speed aerodynamics, learning how to reduce drag, how to extract maximum performance from powerful engines. The S-6B had demonstrated speeds that no fighter could match. Surely some of that knowledge could be transferred to a military machine. Supermarines Board agreed to fund the development, and work began alongside the Schneider preparations. In practice, the result was something close to a disaster. The Type 224 looked nothing like the elegant S-6B. Where the racing seaplane had been a study in streamlined perfection, every surface blended into the next. The fighter was an awkward assembly of compromises. It had an open cockpit, exposing the pilot to the elements at high altitude, a configuration that was already becoming outdated, but which the Air Ministry specifications still permitted. The undercarriage was fixed, housed in enormous trouser-shaped fairings that created drag at every speed. Retracting gear would have been cleaner aerodynamically, but it would have added weight and complexity. Mitchell chose the conservative option. Most unfortunate was the wing, a cranked, inverted gull shape that gave the aircraft an ungainly, broken-backed appearance. The wings bent downward from the fuselage before angling back up toward the tips, creating a profile that looked as though the aircraft had been damaged in transit and improperly reassembled. This odd configuration was not an aesthetic choice. It was a compromise forced by the cooling system, and it represented the fundamental problem with the entire design. The engine was a Rolls-Royce Goshawk, a development of the successful Kestrel series that powered many British aircraft of the period. The Goshawk's distinguishing feature was its cooling system. Instead of using a conventional radiator with its attendant drag, the engine employed evaporative cooling. Water was allowed to boil in jackets around the cylinders, and the resulting steam was piped to condensers built into the wing surfaces. There, the steam would cool, condense back into water, and return to the engine. The theory was elegant. No external radiator, reduced drag, higher speeds. Rolls-Royce had tested the system extensively and believed it represented the future of aircraft engine design. The execution was not elegant at all. The evaporative system required a specific arrangement of condensing surfaces, which dictated the wing's shape. The gull configuration positioned the condenser channels at the correct angle relative to the airflow. But the system never worked properly in service conditions. The engine overheated with depressing regularity, particularly during climbs and combat maneuvers when power demands were highest. Steam leaks developed at joints and seams. The maintenance requirements were considerable. Test pilots reported that the temperature gauges required constant attention, distracting them from the business of actually flying the aircraft. The airframe itself had other problems. The thick wing, necessary to accommodate the condensing system, created more drag than Mitchell had anticipated. The fixed undercarriage with its bulbous fairings added further resistance. The open cockpit, while traditional, meant that pilots suffered badly at altitude, where temperatures could drop well below freezing. The overall impression was of an aircraft designed by committee, with each component optimized for its own requirements rather than for the whole. The Type 224 made its first flight in February 1934, lifting off from Eastleigh Aerodrome near Southampton. The test pilots were not enthusiastic. The aircraft handled adequately, with no vicious characteristics, but it inspired no confidence either. It was stable, which was good for a novice pilot, but stability came at the cost of maneuverability. A fighter needed to turn tightly, to change direction instantly, to follow an enemy through violent maneuvers. The Type 224 preferred straight lines and gentle curves. Maximum speed was 228 miles per hour, below what the specification demanded, and barely faster than the biplanes it was meant to replace. The climb rate was unimpressive. The service ceiling, limited by the cooling system's quirks, fell short of requirements. In almost every measurable parameter, the Type 224 was adequate rather than excellent, and adequacy was not what the Air Ministry sought. The competition for F-730 attracted entries from across the British aircraft industry. Westland submitted a design, Blackburn offered a proposal, Bristol entered an aircraft. Each company believed it understood what modern air combat would require. The Ministry evaluated the submissions through an extended series of trials, testing performance, handling, reliability, and suitability for squadron service. The process took years. In the end, the Air Ministry selected the Gloucester Gladiator, a biplane. The winning design had 2 wings, an open cockpit, and a configuration that would have been familiar to pilots of the Great War. It was faster than the Type 224, more maneuverable, and considerably more pleasant to fly. Gloucester had refined the biplane formula to its ultimate expression, extracting performance that monoplanes of the period struggled to match. The man who had built the fastest aircraft in the world, who had pushed speeds beyond 400 miles per hour, had lost a fighter competition to an aircraft with 2 wings and fixed landing gear. The contrast was stark. The S-6B represented the cutting edge of aeronautical achievement. The Type 224 represented a failed attempt to translate that achievement into something practical. Speed alone, Mitchell learned, was not enough. A fighter had to do many things well, not just one thing brilliantly. It was a humbling experience. Mitchell never spoke publicly about the Type 224 with anything but disappointment. He had made errors of judgment, accepted compromises that should have been rejected, allowed the cooling system's demands to dictate the airframe's shape when he should have demanded a better cooling system. The evaporative system, which Rolls-Royce had promoted so confidently, was simply not ready for operational use. Mitchell had trusted the engine manufacturer's assurances, and that trust had been misplaced. Yet failure has its uses. The months of testing, the disappointing performance figures, the unfavorable comparisons with rival designs, all of this gave Mitchell clarity about what a successful fighter would require. He understood now exactly what had gone wrong. Too many compromises, too much inherited thinking, too little willingness to abandon what did not work. The open cockpit belonged to an earlier era. Fixed undercarriage was no longer acceptable. The evaporative cooling system was a dead end that had distorted the entire design. He also understood what had gone right with the S-6B and wrong with the Type 224. The racing seaplane had been designed with a single purpose, speed. Every element served that goal. Nothing was included that did not contribute to performance. The fighter, by contrast, had tried to satisfy multiple masters, and in doing so had satisfied none of them properly. The lesson was clear. Begin with the right requirements, refuse to compromise on fundamentals, and let the design emerge from necessity rather than convention. Even before the Air Ministry delivered its verdict on F-730, Mitchell had begun sketching something new, something that owed nothing to the Type 224's mistakes. The drawings showed a small, clean monoplane with an enclosed cockpit and retractable undercarriage. The wing was thin and elliptical, a shape that promised both low drag and adequate internal volume. The engine would not be the troublesome Goshawk, but something newer, something still in development at Rolls-Royce. Mitchell did not yet know what this aircraft would become. He knew only that it would be different. Supermarines Board, despite the Type 224 debacle, had not lost faith in their chief designer. They agreed to fund a new project with private money, supplemented by Vickers, the parent company. Mitchell would have freedom to design without the constraints of an Air Ministry specification. No compromises for outdated requirements, no evaporative cooling, no gull wings. He designated the project Type 300. The basic configuration emerged quickly, an enclosed cockpit because pilots fighting at 20,000 feet should not be exposed to temperatures of 40 degrees below zero, retractable undercarriage because fixed gear belonged to the previous decade, a thin wing because thin wings meant less drag and higher speeds. But the wing presented a problem that would require an unusual solution. Mitchell had hired a young Canadian aerodynamicist named Beverly Shenstone. The appointment was unconventional. Shenstone had spent a year working for Junkers in Germany, learning metal construction techniques that British firms had largely ignored. After Junkers, he had studied under Alexander Lippisch, the pioneer of tailless and delta-wing aircraft. Shenstone understood German aerodynamic theory, particularly the work coming out of Göttingen, which was more advanced than anything being taught in British universities. When Mitchell interviewed him, he was unimpressed by Shenstone's knowledge of practical construction, but recognized the value of his theoretical background. He offered the Canadian a position at £500 per year. Shenstone's contribution to the Type 300 would prove decisive. Mitchell wanted the thinnest possible wing for maximum speed, but the Air Ministry had recently increased its armament requirements. Any new fighter would need 8 machine guns, not 4. 8 guns with their ammunition would not fit inside a conventional thin wing with straight taper. The structure simply could not accommodate them. Shenstone proposed an elliptical planform. The idea was not new. A British theorist named Frederick Lanchester had described the aerodynamic advantages of elliptical wings as early as 1907. An ellipse distributes lift more efficiently than other shapes, reducing the drag that forms at wingtips. But Shenstone's design was not a simple ellipse. It was a modified, asymmetrical shape using 2 different aerofoil sections that varied across the span. The wing was thin at the root where it joined the fuselage, but grew thicker toward the middle of the span before tapering again toward the tips. This configuration provided the internal volume needed for the guns while maintaining the thin sections that Mitchell demanded for speed. A myth would later emerge that the Spitfire's wing was copied from the German Heinkel He-70, a fast mailplane that Mitchell had admired. The story is false. The He-70 did have an elliptical wing, but it was a symmetrical ellipse with a different purpose. Mitchell had written to Ernst Heinkel praising the aircraft's smooth finish, which Supermarine could not yet match, but the wing designs shared nothing beyond a superficial resemblance to an oval. Shenstone himself dismissed the copying allegation whenever it surfaced, pointing out that the aerodynamic principles involved had been published decades earlier. Mitchell's response to Shenstone's theoretical explanations was characteristically blunt. When the Canadian described the mathematical advantages of elliptical lift distribution, Mitchell cut him short. He did not care whether the wing was elliptical or rectangular or shaped like a banana, he said, so long as it covered the guns. Elegance was secondary, function was everything. The engine would be a new Rolls-Royce design, the PV-12, still under development, but promising significant improvements over existing power plants. Rolls-Royce engineers were confident they could deliver over 1,000 horsepower from a compact, liquid-cooled 12-cylinder unit. Cooling would be conventional, with an underwing radiator designed by the Royal Aircraft Establishment. No evaporative systems, no compromises. In December 1934, the Air Ministry committed £10,000 toward construction of a prototype. They also wrote a new specification, F-1035, around Mitchell's design rather than asking him to modify his aircraft to meet existing requirements. It was an unusual arrangement that reflected both the Ministry's desperation for modern fighters and their faith in Supermarine's designer. Construction proceeded through 1935. The prototype, given the military serial number K054, took shape in Supermarine's workshops at Woolston. By early 1936, it was ready for flight testing. The aircraft that emerged was visually striking, compact, purposeful, with that distinctive elliptical wing and a long nose housing the Rolls-Royce engine. It looked fast standing still. 5th of March, 1936. Eastleigh Aerodrome, a grass field northeast of Southampton that would later become the city's airport. The weather was acceptable, the wind light. Captain Joseph Summers, Vickers' chief test pilot, known universally as Mutt, walked around the pale blue prototype, conducting his pre-flight inspection. At 4:30 in the afternoon, he climbed into the enclosed cockpit, started the engine, and taxied to the downwind end of the field. The first flight lasted 8 minutes. Summers took the aircraft up, circled the aerodrome, tested the basic controls, and brought it back down. He did not attempt anything ambitious. First flights are for discovering whether an aircraft will fly at all, not for exploring its limits. K5054 flew. It flew well. After landing, Summers taxied back to the waiting group of engineers and designers. Mitchell was there, watching. Summers climbed out of the cockpit and addressed the ground crew with 4 words that would become famous. "Do not touch anything." The phrase has been interpreted ever since as an endorsement of perfection, a test pilot's declaration that the aircraft needed no improvement. The reality was more prosaic. Summers meant that the settings should be preserved for the next flight so he could continue his evaluation without variables changing between sorties. But legends are more appealing than logistics, and the story of the perfect first flight has endured. Testing continued through the spring. Summers and the other pilots discovered that the Type 300 was fast, maneuverable, and pleasant to fly. It had vices, the rudder was too sensitive, the cockpit too cramped, the undercarriage mechanism troublesome. But these were fixable problems. The fundamental design was sound. By May, with a new propeller fitted, the prototype reached 348 miles per hour in level flight. It was not the fastest aircraft Mitchell had built, but it was the fastest fighter anyone had built. On 3rd of June, 1936, less than 3 months after the first flight, the Air Ministry placed an order for 310 aircraft. No British fighter had ever been ordered in such quantity from a single manufacturer. The Ministry had not even waited for the official evaluation trials to conclude. They had seen enough. The aircraft needed a name. Supermarine's chairman, Sir Robert Maclean, had a suggestion. His daughter Anne was famously spirited, quick-tempered, difficult to manage. The family called her a little Spitfire. Maclean thought the name suited the new fighter. Small, fierce, not to be underestimated. Mitchell was unimpressed. It was just the sort of bloody silly name they would choose, he told colleagues. He had wanted to call it something austere, something that reflected its purpose, rather than someone's domestic circumstances. But naming rights belonged to the manufacturer, and Spitfire it became. Mitchell never reconciled himself to the choice. He would not live to see the name become synonymous with British defiance. The story of the Spitfire's creation is usually told as a narrative of technical triumph, of problems solved and obstacles overcome. There is another story underneath it, one that Mitchell never discussed publicly and that his colleagues learned only after he was gone. It is a story about time and about what a man can accomplish when he knows how little of it remains. In August 1933, nearly 3 years before the first flight of the prototype, Mitchell underwent a routine medical examination before a family holiday. The examination was meant to be a formality. Mitchell had been working punishing hours on the Schneider Trophy campaign, and his wife Florence thought a trip to the continent would do him good. The doctors found something unexpected during their assessment. Further tests confirmed the diagnosis: cancer of the rectum. In 1933, this was effectively a sentence. Oncology was primitive by modern standards. Radiation therapy existed but was crude and often ineffective. Chemotherapy, as we understand it, had not been developed. Surgical intervention was the only realistic option, and even that offered limited prospects. Survival rates for rectal cancer were measured in months rather than years. The medical profession could offer treatment but not cure. Mitchell was 38 years old, at the peak of his professional powers, with his most important work still ahead of him. He was told he would likely not see 45. He underwent surgery immediately. The procedure was a colostomy, an operation that diverts the bowel through an opening in the abdominal wall. In the 1930s, this was a permanent and life-altering intervention. There were no modern appliances, no discreet pouching systems, no support groups or rehabilitation programs. Patients lived with a bag attached to their abdomen, managed the apparatus themselves, and coped with the physical and psychological consequences as best they could. The procedure was considered so debilitating that most patients in Mitchell's situation withdrew from professional life entirely. Some attempted to work from home. Many simply waited for the end, their remaining time consumed by the management of their condition. Mitchell returned to his office at Supermarine within weeks of leaving hospital. He told no one about his diagnosis. His wife knew, of course, and presumably his closest family members. But his colleagues, the men he worked with every day, the engineers and draftsmen who looked to him for direction, were kept in ignorance. Mitchell arrived at his usual time, attended meetings, reviewed drawings, argued about specifications. His colleagues noticed that he seemed thinner than before, perhaps more easily tired. They attributed it to the pressure of work. The Schneider Trophy had been demanding, and now the Type 224 was going badly. Of course he looked strained, anyone would. The colostomy bag was invisible beneath his clothes. His discomfort was invisible behind his professional manner. His colleagues saw R.J. Mitchell, chief designer, doing what he had always done. They did not see a man managing a terminal illness while trying to complete the most important project of his career. What happened next was unexpected, and it reveals something essential about Mitchell's character. In December 1933, 4 months after major surgery for a disease that would likely claim his life within a few years, Mitchell enrolled in flying lessons at the Hampshire Aero Club. He had designed aircraft for 15 years. He had built the fastest machines in the world. He had shaped the future of British aviation, and he had never once sat at the controls of an aeroplane himself. This was not unusual for aircraft designers of his generation. Design work happened at drawing boards and in wind tunnels, not in cockpits. The division between those who conceived aircraft and those who flew them was well established. Many successful designers went their entire careers without piloting their own creations. Mitchell had always relied on test pilots to tell him how his aircraft behaved, translating their observations into engineering improvements. It was a system that worked. But now, facing mortality, Mitchell wanted to understand what his creations felt like from the inside. He wanted to know the sensations that pilots experienced, the physical feedback of controls, the way an aircraft responded to inputs. Perhaps he also wanted something else. A direct connection to the machines that would be his legacy, an experience that no amount of technical data could provide. He trained on a de Havilland Tiger Moth, the standard instruction aircraft of the period. It was an open cockpit biplane, docile and forgiving, designed to teach student pilots the fundamentals of flight without punishing their mistakes too severely. Mitchell would have sat in the front cockpit with an instructor behind him, learning to coordinate stick and rudder, to read the instruments, to feel the aircraft's behavior through the seat of his pants. For a man who understood aerodynamics at a theoretical level that few could match, the practical experience must have been revelatory. He proved to be a competent, if not exceptional, pilot. His instructors noted that he approached flying with the same methodical attention he brought to design work. He did not take unnecessary risks or attempt maneuvers beyond his skill level. In July 1934, after the required hours of instruction and solo flight, Mitchell received his pilot's license. He was 39 years old. He carried a colostomy bag beneath his flying suit. He had perhaps 3 years to live, and now he could fly. The work on Type 300 proceeded through 1934 and 35, with Mitchell driving every decision. The failure of the Type 224 had clarified his thinking. The new design would accept no compromises. Every choice would serve performance. Mitchell attended design meetings, reviewed drawings, argued with the Air Ministry over specifications, and supervised construction of the prototype. He worked long hours, as he always had, but now those hours were borrowed against an account that was rapidly depleting. His colleagues remembered him during this period as demanding but fair. He did not tolerate excuses or half measures, but he gave credit generously and defended his team against outside criticism. He had a gift for identifying the essential problem in a design and cutting through peripheral concerns to address it. He also had a temper, which emerged when he encountered stupidity or obstruction. The Air Ministry bureaucrats who questioned his judgments learned to tread carefully. Mitchell had little patience remaining, and he would not waste it on fools. None of them knew that he was working against a deadline they could not see. The urgency that drove him had a source beyond professional ambition. Every month that passed was a month subtracted from a finite total. Every delay in the program was time he might not have. Mitchell never spoke of this to his colleagues. He simply worked and expected them to work, and pushed the project forward with an intensity that seemed excessive, even by his demanding standards. The first flight in March 1936 must have been a complicated triumph. Mitchell watched from the edge of Eastleigh Aerodrome as Mutt Summers took his aircraft into the air. 8 minutes of flight, 8 minutes during which the accumulated work of years was tested against reality. Summers landed, taxied back, and delivered his verdict. The design was sound, the aircraft flew beautifully, Mitchell had succeeded. But the success was shadowed. Mitchell knew, with reasonable certainty, that he would not live to see the Spitfire in combat. The aircraft would take years to develop fully, years to enter squadron service, years to prove itself against whatever enemies Britain might face. Mitchell would not be there. The Spitfire would defend Britain without its creator, and its creator would never know whether his work had been good enough. In 1936, shortly after the triumphant first flight, the cancer returned. The disease had never truly been defeated, only held at bay. Now it resumed its advance. Mitchell continued working through the autumn, attending meetings and reviewing progress on the production program. But by early 1937, his condition had deteriorated beyond the point where he could maintain his office schedule. His weight had dropped alarmingly. His energy was failing. He was forced to step back from daily involvement with Supermarine. Joseph Smith, the chief draftsman who had worked alongside Mitchell for years, assumed responsibility for the ongoing development program. Smith understood Mitchell's design philosophy and could be trusted to carry the work forward. The transition was orderly, professional, and heartbreaking. Mitchell was handing over his life's work to another man because he would not live to complete it himself. But he could not stay away entirely. On days when his strength permitted, Mitchell would have himself driven to Eastleigh Aerodrome. He could no longer walk comfortably or stand for extended periods. Instead, he sat in his car at the edge of the airfield, watching the prototype fly. The test pilots knew he was there. They would sometimes adjust their patterns to pass over his position, giving him a clear view of the aircraft he had created. It was a small kindness, an acknowledgement of what the frail man in the parked car had accomplished. The Spitfire, by this point, was nearing the end of its initial flight test program. The early problems had been addressed, the production drawings were being finalized, orders were being placed. Everything Mitchell had worked toward was coming to fruition, and he could only watch from the margins, too weak to participate, too stubborn to look away. On the 11th of June, 1937, Reginald Joseph Mitchell passed away at his home in Southampton. He was 42 years old. He had designed 24 aircraft in his career, won the Schneider Trophy permanently for Britain, and created what would become the most famous fighter in aviation history. He never saw a single Spitfire delivered to an operational squadron. He never saw his aircraft engage an enemy. He never knew whether the design that had consumed his final years would prove adequate to the challenges ahead. His funeral reflected the man. Mitchell had requested that the members of his design team be given precedence in the procession, walking ahead of family and dignitaries. Throughout his career, he had insisted that credit for Supermarine's achievements belonged to the team rather than to any individual. He deflected praise, shared recognition, and resisted the cult of personality that often surrounds successful designers. Even in his final arrangements, he maintained that principle. The men who had drawn the lines and calculated the stresses and solved the problems walked first. Their leader followed. The Royal Air Force would not receive its first Spitfires until August 1938, more than a year after Mitchell's passing. No. 19 Squadron at Duxford became the first operational unit to fly the type. The Battle of Britain lay 3 years in the future. The aircraft that would become a symbol of national survival had lost its creator before it ever fired a shot. Mitchell had given Britain its sword, then departed before he could see it drawn. Mitchell had given Britain a superb design. Turning that design into a fighting force was another matter entirely. Supermarine was a small company. Their Woolston factory near Southampton employed skilled craftsmen who built aircraft largely by hand. When the Air Ministry ordered 310 Spitfires in June 1936, Supermarine promised 5 aircraft per week. The first production Spitfire did not fly until May 1938, nearly 2 years late. The elliptical wing, aerodynamically elegant, was a nightmare to manufacture. By September 1939, when Britain declared war, the Royal Air Force had just 306 Spitfires. Fighter Command needed hundreds more. The government had anticipated this problem. In 1938, construction began on a vast shadow factory at Castle Bromwich near Birmingham, purpose-built for Spitfire production. Management was entrusted to Lord Nuffield, founder of Morris Motors. The theory was sound. Nuffield understood mass production. His car plants turned out vehicles by the thousand. If anyone could apply automotive efficiency to aircraft manufacture, it was him. Aircraft were not automobiles. The tolerances were finer, the skills more specialized. Workers trained to assemble car bodies found themselves baffled by aircraft structures. The budget doubled from £2 million to £4 million. The factory was supposed to produce 60 Spitfires per week by April 1940. When April arrived, with German forces pouring through France, Castle Bromwich had not produced a single aircraft, not one. On the 17th of May, the new Minister of Aircraft Production telephoned Lord Nuffield. Lord Beaverbrook, the Canadian-born press baron, had been in the job for 3 days. He demanded to know why 0 Spitfires. Nuffield listed difficulties: untrained workers, inadequate drawings, uncooperative suppliers. He grew defensive. If Beaverbrook thought he could do better, perhaps he should take over the factory himself. Beaverbrook replied that he accepted, then he hung up. Vickers Armstrongs took control. Experienced workers arrived from Southampton. In June, Castle Bromwich delivered 10 Spitfires. In July, 23. In August, 37. In September, 56. That same September, German bombers wrecked the Supermarine Works at Woolston. If Castle Bromwich had still been producing nothing, the Spitfire programme would have faced catastrophe. Instead, the Birmingham factory absorbed the burden. By the end of the war, Castle Bromwich would build more than 12,000 Spitfires, over half of all those manufactured. The factory that nearly strangled the programme became its salvation. The summer of 1940 would test Mitchell's creation as he never lived to see. The Luftwaffe had assembled more than 2,500 aircraft across occupied France. RAF Fighter Command could put up roughly 750 fighters. 2 types carried the burden: the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. The Hurricane had flown 4 months earlier and was easier to build. When the battle began, Hurricanes equipped 32 squadrons, Spitfires 19. There is a popular myth: Spitfires engaged German fighters while Hurricanes attacked bombers. Untrue. Keith Park and Hugh Dowding sent whatever squadrons were available against whatever formations appeared. You scrambled what you had. Hurricanes shot down approximately 60% of all German aircraft destroyed. Spitfires around 40%, but there were nearly twice as many Hurricanes flying. In fighter versus fighter combat, the Spitfire achieved a better kill ratio against the Messerschmitt 109. Both aircraft were essential. The Hurricane was the workhorse, sturdy, simple to repair. The Spitfire was the thoroughbred, faster, more agile, demanding more skill but rewarding it. Britain needed every airframe of both types. Yet the Spitfire became the legend. Partly propaganda. Journalists visited Spitfire factories, not Hurricane plants. Partly aesthetics. The Spitfire was simply beautiful, and partly psychology. German pilots shot down by Hurricanes frequently claimed a Spitfire had got them. One Luftwaffe pilot dismissed the Hurricane as a tired old nag. To admit such an aircraft had bested you was humiliating. There is a famous exchange. Hermann Goering visited his fighter pilots in France as the battle turned against them. What did they need to win? Werner Mölders asked for more powerful engines. Adolf Galland replied, "Give me a squadron of Spitfires." The phrase is often quoted as proof that Germany's greatest ace considered the Spitfire superior. The context tells a different story. Goering had ordered close escort with bombers, surrendering every advantage the 109 possessed. Galland was furious. His response was sarcasm. "If you force me to fly like a Spitfire pilot, give me a Spitfire." He flew Messerschmitts for the rest of the war. But the quote entered history without its context. Achtung, Spitfire. The words in Luftwaffe radio channels meant the elegant little fighter was somewhere nearby, hunting. By late October, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 1,600 aircraft. The invasion was postponed forever. Britain remained undefeated, the first nation to turn back Hitler's forces. Mitchell's fighter had passed its test, but it was only beginning. Reginald Mitchell created the Spitfire Mark I. He never saw it fire a shot in anger. After his death, Joseph Smith became chief designer at Supermarine. Smith had worked alongside Mitchell for more than a decade. He understood the philosophy behind the Spitfire. More importantly, he understood that Mitchell had designed an aircraft with room to grow. Test pilot Geoffrey Quill would later say, "If Mitchell was born to design the Spitfire, Joe Smith was born to defend it and develop it." The Mark I carried a Merlin engine producing 1,030 horsepower, maximum speed 362 miles per hour. By the Mark XIV, the Merlin had given way to the larger Griffon, delivering 2,050 horsepower and 440 miles per hour. The final variant, the Mark 24, produced 2,340 horsepower. The elegant airframe Mitchell had drawn in 1933 absorbed more than double its original power without losing its essential character. 24 marks, more than 40 distinct modifications, the only fighter aircraft in the world that was produced before, during, and after the Second World War. The last Spitfires flew combat missions in Malaya in the 1950s, nearly 2 decades after Mitchell's death. There is an irony here that history seems to have arranged deliberately. Mitchell designed 24 different aircraft during his career. His last design, the Spitfire, went through 24 marks, as if the numbers were completing a pattern he never knew he had started. The Spitfire that won the Battle of Britain and the Spitfire that flew over Malayan jungles were almost different aircraft, but at their core lay the same idea: the thin elliptical wing, the clean lines, the marriage of speed and grace that Mitchell had first achieved with his racing seaplanes. Today, the original S-6B stands in the Science Museum in London. Beside it rests the silver Schneider Trophy that Lady Houston's money helped win. In the 1960s, Airfix sold 350,000 plastic Spitfire models every year, 4 times more than the Hurricane. Mitchell never reconciled himself to the name. He thought Spitfire was bloody silly and said so. He did not live to see that word become synonymous with Britain itself, with defiance, with the refusal to surrender when the mathematics said you should. He died at 42 in a suburban house in Southampton, with his greatest work still untested in combat. He never heard Achtung Spitfire crackle through German radios. He never saw the factory at Castle Bromwich turn out 12,000 of his fighters. He never knew that schoolboys for generations would build models of his aircraft and dream of flight. But his aircraft knew. It flew on without him, through the Battle of Britain and the skies over Normandy and the jungles of Southeast Asia. It outlived the war, outlived the empire, outlived everyone who had doubted whether a small company in Southampton could build a world-beating fighter. Reginald Mitchell did not live to see any of it, but his Spitfire did.